Not every great band made it into the history books. Some of them were everywhere for a few years. On the radio, on MTV, on the back of every notebook. And then they were just gone. Here are 10 bands only true Gen X remember. Number 10, The Fix. The Fix were a London-based new wave band that came together in the late 1970s under the name Portraits, before settling on their final name in 1980. The lineup that made their name consisted of vocalist Cy Curnin, guitarist Jamie West Oram, keyboardist Rupert Greenall, bassist Dan K. Brown, and drummer Adam Woods. Their sound sat at the intersection of post-punk tension and polished pop production. Propulsive, slightly anxious, built on synthesizers and interlocking guitar lines. Their 1982 debut album Shuttered Room found a following in the United Kingdom and introduced them to American college radio. But it was Reach the Beach in 1983 that broke them in the United States. The album produced One Thing Leads to Another, which reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and it became one of the defining new wave singles of that year. The song was on every radio station that summer, and the band's sharp visual aesthetic, angular, slightly cold, intensely stylized, made them a natural fit for the still new MTV. Cy Curnin's vocal style was precise without being cold, and the band's rhythm section gave their songs a propulsive quality that kept them from drifting too far into the purely atmospheric. Their follow-up album Phantoms in 1984 performed well, and Are We Ourselves became another recognizable radio track heard regularly on mainstream stations. But the band's commercial trajectory began to slow from that point. Walkabout in 1986 had its moments, but didn't match the commercial reach of their earlier work. Subsequent releases through the late 1980s found a shrinking mainstream audience, even as the band's songwriting continued to develop. The Fix never formally disbanded. They have toured and released new material periodically through the decades, maintaining a loyal audience on the nostalgia circuit. Curnin in particular has spoken thoughtfully in interviews about the band's place in the cultural moment they occupied. A band that was genuinely of their time, making music that couldn't have existed before synthesizers and MTV. And that sounded like nothing else once both of those things were gone. They have never had a reunion in the traditional sense because they never stopped. Number 9, Quarterflash. Quarterflash were a Portland, Oregon band built around husband and wife duo Rindy Ross and Marv Ross. Rindy Ross was the band's lead vocalist and played saxophone, a combination that gave them an instantly distinctive sound in the early 1980s landscape. In an era when synthesizers and guitar were the primary textures of new wave and rock radio, a saxophone carrying the melodic lead was unusual enough to make the band immediately identifiable. Their debut single, Harden My Heart, was released in 1981 and reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was a clean, powerful piece of pop rock, and Rindy Ross's voice had a quality that cut through radio immediately. Controlled, slightly raw, and emotionally direct. The saxophone lead gave the song a texture that distinguished it from virtually everything else on the chart at the time. The album Quarterflash followed and went platinum in the United States. A second single, Find Another Fool, reached number 16 on the Hot 100, giving them 2 significant chart hits from the debut. A second album, Take Another Picture, arrived in 1983. The title track found some chart success, but the album failed to replicate the commercial impact of the debut. Radio moved on quickly in those years, and bands that had arrived on the back of a single distinctive sound found that the same sound could become familiar almost overnight. A third album came and went with minimal impact, and the band dissolved in 1988. Marv and Rindy Ross subsequently formed a new project and continued making music on a smaller scale in the Pacific Northwest. Quarterflash reunited periodically over the following decades for performances, and Harden My Heart has remained a reliable fixture on classic rock and new wave radio formats. It is the kind of song that stops people mid-conversation when it comes on. A moment of recognition followed quickly by the realization that most people would struggle to name the band responsible for it. Number 8, The Alarm. The Alarm formed in Rhyl, Wales in 1977 under a different name before settling into their final lineup and identity in the early 1980s. The band consisted of vocalist and guitarist Mike Peters, guitarist Dave Sharp, bassist Eddie McDonald, and drummer Nigel Twist. Their sound drew heavily from punk energy and folk rock traditions simultaneously. Acoustic guitars played with aggressive urgency, anthemic vocals that pushed toward the epic, and lyrics rooted in political and personal conviction. They signed to IRS Records and released their debut album Declaration in 1984. In the United States, they built a strong college radio following, and their live shows developed a reputation for intensity and genuine emotional commitment. The band was frequently compared to U2, a comparison that followed them through their entire career, largely because both bands used big sound and impassioned delivery to reach for something larger than standard rock. Peters has addressed that comparison many times over the years, sometimes with good humor and sometimes with evident frustration. The similarities were real, but so were the differences. Strength in 1985 and Eye of the Hurricane in 1987 continued to develop their sound and maintained their position on college radio and among a devoted transatlantic fan base. The Stand and Strength received significant airplay on rock radio stations catering to the college market. Their American commercial breakthrough, however, never fully materialized in the way their energy and ambition suggested it might. They were always a band with fervent fans rather than enormous sales figures. The Alarm disbanded in 1991, following the departures of Dave Sharp and then Eddie McDonald. Peters relaunched the band in various configurations through the 1990s and 2000s, releasing new material under the Alarm name and maintaining the band's identity, even through periods when the lineup bore little resemblance to the original. In 2004, he released a single under the name The Poppy Fields. A young-sounding recording later revealed to have been made by Peters and his collaborators as a commentary on ageism in the music industry. The Alarm has continued performing and recording under his leadership to the present day. For a certain kind of Gen X music fan, the kind who listened to college radio, went to small venues, and took the music seriously, the Alarm were not a footnote. They were a genuine touchstone. Number 7, Til Tuesday. Til Tuesday formed in Boston in 1983, emerging from the Berklee College of Music scene that produced a number of significant acts during that decade. The band was built around vocalist and bassist Amy Mann, guitarist Robert Holmes, keyboardist Joey Pesci, and drummer Michael Hausman. Mann had an exceptional vocal instrument, clear, slightly detached, capable of conveying emotional complexity without ever tipping into melodrama. Their debut single, Voices Carry, was released in 1985 and reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. The accompanying music video, which depicted a young woman being silenced and embarrassed by her older, socially sophisticated boyfriend in Carnegie Hall, received heavy MTV rotation and gave the song a visual narrative that lodged in memory. The album, Voices Carry, went gold. The follow-up albums, Welcome Home in 1986 and Everything's Different, now in 1988, showed Mann's songwriting developing in interesting directions, but neither achieved the commercial reach of the debut. By the end of the decade, the band had effectively wound down, and Mann launched a solo career that eventually earned her significant critical recognition, including an Academy Award nomination for her work on the Magnolia soundtrack in 1999. The trajectory of Til Tuesday is a specific kind of Gen X story, a band that arrived at exactly the right moment for MTV, made one song that became genuinely iconic, and then developed into something more sophisticated that fewer people followed. Mann's solo work found the audience that the band's later albums didn't reach, but those who were there for Voices Carry in 1985 remember it as a distinct and vivid moment. Number 6, Big Country. Big Country formed in Dunfermline, Scotland in 1981. The core of the band was Stuart Adamson and Bruce Watson on guitars, Tony Butler on bass, and Mark Brzezicki on drums. Adamson had previously been the guitarist and primary songwriter of the post-punk band Skids, and he brought that background to a new project that aimed at something larger and more emotionally expansive. The band's signature sound came from Adamson and Watson's guitar work, which used volume pedals and specific playing techniques to make electric guitars produce sounds that evoked bagpipes and Highland folk music. It was an entirely original approach, unmistakable within a few seconds of hearing it, and deeply connected to the Scottish landscape and culture that shaped Adamson's sensibility. Their debut album, The Crossing, was released in 1983 and became a significant commercial success in the United Kingdom, reaching number 3 on the UK Albums Chart and a respected college radio album in the United States. In a Big Country, reached number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became the song most American audiences associated with them. Fields of Fire was another well-received single in the UK. The album's sound was ambitious and fully realized from the outset. Adamson had arrived with a clear vision and the technical means to execute it. The 1984 follow-up Steeltown performed strongly in the UK and continued the band's evolution. The Seer in 1986 and Peace in Our Time in 1988 maintained their British following, though each successive album found a somewhat smaller commercial footprint outside the UK. The band continued to release albums through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, maintaining a substantial following in Britain while their American profile gradually diminished. In the United States, they remained a band known to dedicated music listeners rather than a mainstream radio presence. Stuart Adamson struggled with alcohol dependency through the 1990s, and the band's fortunes reflected his personal difficulties during that period. He took his own life in December 2001 in a hotel room in Honolulu, a death that shocked the band's community of fans deeply. He was 46 years old. Watson, Butler, and Brzezicki have continued performing as Big Country with subsequent vocalists and guitarists. The band that made In a Big Country belonged entirely to Adamson. His voice, his guitar sound, his way of turning Scottish identity into something universal. That version of the band existed for about a decade, and it left music that still sounds like nothing else. Number 5, The Church. The Church formed in Sydney, Australia in 1980. built around guitarist and vocalist Steve Kilbey and guitarists Marty Wilson Piper and Peter Koppes. They were part of the broader post-punk movement, but occupied a specific, recognizable space within it, melodic and atmospheric, heavily influenced by psychedelic rock of the 1960s, built on layers of jangling guitar and Kilby's baritone vocals, which had a dreamlike, slightly dissociated quality. The band built a following in Australia through the early 1980s and began finding audiences in the United States and United Kingdom through college radio and import record shops. Their 1982 album, The Blurred Crusade, is regarded by many listeners as one of the finest records of that era, a deeply melodic, atmospherically rich album that held together as a complete listening experience rather than a collection of singles. It remained largely unknown outside of dedicated music circles at the time of its release, which was the fate of most of what the Church made in their first decade. Then, in 1988, Under the Milky Way was released as a single from the album reached number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100 and received extensive MTV and radio airplay through that year. For a band that had spent nearly a decade building a quiet, devoted following on the margins of mainstream attention, the sudden visibility was striking and somewhat unexpected. The song has a quality, hushed, melancholic, suspended in time in a way that makes it difficult to place, that makes it feel more like a memory than a recording. It sounded unlike anything else on radio in 1988. The Church continued making records through the following decades with considerable consistency, releasing ambitious albums that found critical appreciation and maintained their loyal following without achieving mainstream commercial success. Kilby has spoken in interviews about the experience of having one song so widely known, while the broader catalog remains the possession of a smaller, intensely devoted audience. Their 2009 album, Untitled Number 23, was regarded by longtime fans as one of their strongest works. The Church are still recording and performing today. For those who found them through Under the Milky Way and then went deeper into the catalog, it was one of the more rewarding musical discoveries available in that era. 4. Wall of Voodoo. Wall of Voodoo formed in Los Angeles in the late 1970s from members of a film music collective. The original lineup included vocalist Stan Ridgway, guitarist Mark Moreland, keyboardist and bassist Bruce Moreland, keyboardist Chaz T. Gray, and drummer Joe Nannini. Their sound was one of the more genuinely peculiar things on American radio in the early 1980s. Gothic, cinematic, darkly comic, and built on synthesizer textures that suggested spaghetti westerns filtered through something considerably stranger. Their 1982 single Mexican Radio reached number 58 on the Billboard Hot 100, which does not sound impressive until you hear the song and consider that it reached any pop chart at all. The track is built around a lurching rhythm, carnival-esque keyboards, and Ridgway's deadpan vocal delivery, which described listening to an AM radio station broadcasting from across the Mexican border in terms that sounded simultaneously mundane and deeply unsettling. The music video, directed with a dark, slightly surreal visual sensibility, received heavy MTV rotation, which was crucial to whatever mainstream exposure the band found. I'm on a Mexican World Radio. Their 1982 album Call of the West was produced by Richard Mazur and contained some of the most distinctive rock music released that year, though few people outside college radio and certain Los Angeles circles noticed at the time. Ridgway departed in 1983 to pursue a solo career that would prove to be one of the more genuinely eccentric bodies of work in American rock, narrative-driven, literary, and consistently resistant to commercial formulas. He released his debut solo album, The Big Heat, in 1986 to strong critical reception, and an audience that remained enthusiastically small. The band continued with a new vocalist, Andy Preboy, and released 7 Days in Sammy's Town in 1985 and Happy Planet in 1987, which had their admirers but found limited commercial traction. Preboy later became a respected songwriter and playwright in his own right. The band dissolved in 1988. Mark Moreland, one of the founding guitarists, died in 1994 from organ failure. The Wall of Voodoo catalog has been revisited periodically by listeners who find it through Mexican radio and discover that the rest of it is just as strange, and that just as strange turns out to be a feature rather than a problem. I'm on a Mexican radio. Number 3, the Psychedelic Furs. The Psychedelic Furs formed in London in 1977, anchored by brothers Richard Butler on vocals and Tim Butler on bass, with guitarist John Ashton as the third constant in the band's core. Richard Butler's voice was one of the more distinctive instruments in British post-punk, grainy, slightly ravaged, emotionally raw, in a way that sounded genuinely lived in rather than performed. Their early albums, The Psychedelic Furs in 1980 and Talk 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 in 1981, built them a strong following on both sides of the Atlantic among listeners drawn to the darker, more atmospheric end of new wave. Pretty in Pink, a track from Talk Talk Talk, was written about a young woman navigating social humiliation and cruelty, and it found a significant second life when filmmaker John Hughes used the title for his 1986 coming-of-age film and asked the band to re-record a new version for the soundtrack. That re-recorded version reached number 41 on the Billboard Hot 100 and introduced the band to a considerably wider audience, including many younger teenagers who had no awareness of the band's earlier work. The irony was that by the time the film arrived, the band was already past their creative peak and had gone through significant lineup changes. The original version of Pretty in Pink from 1981 was rawer, spikier, and arguably more affecting than the polished 1986 re-recording made to fit the film's more accessible tone. But it was the smoother version that most people heard first, and for much of the audience that discovered the Furs through the movie, the original remained unknown. Their albums Forever Now in 1982 and Mirror Moves in 1984 had genuine strengths, with Mirror Moves in particular showing Butler as a vocalist at his most expressive. Midnight to Midnight in 1987 pursued a more aggressively commercial direction that alienated some longtime fans and failed to win a new audience large enough to compensate. The band dissolved in 1991. Richard Butler formed Love Spit Love in the 1990s, and the Furs reunited in 2000, continuing to perform and release new material through subsequent decades. Their 2020 album, Made of Rain, was their first new studio record in 29 years and received warm reviews. For Gen X listeners, the Psychedelic Furs occupy a very specific position, a band whose name most people know from a film, whose early catalog rewards the listeners who went looking for it, and whose sound remains identifiably theirs across 4 decades of work. Number 2, The Replacements. The Replacements formed in Minneapolis in 1979 around vocalist and guitarist Paul Westerberg, guitarist Bob Stinson, bassist Tommy Stinson, and drummer Chris Mars. What began as a teenage punk band evolved through the early 1980s into something considerably more complex. A band capable of extraordinary emotional directness and almost deliberate self-sabotage, often within the same show or the same album. Their early records on the Twin/Tone label, Sorry Ma, Forgot to Take Out the Trash in 1981 and Stink in 1982, were raw punk records made fast and cheap, documenting a teenage band that played with a ferocity that exceeded their years. Hootenanny in 1983 showed Westerberg beginning to stretch, incorporating country and garage rock elements that pointed towards something more expansive. Let It Be in 1984 delivered on that promise, an album that moved between piano ballads, country-inflected songs, and guitar noise without apology or transition, as if Westerberg was making a record for himself and would sort out the audience later. It is still regarded by many critics as one of the essential American rock albums of the 1980s. The band signed to Sire Records and released Tim in 1985 and Pleased to Meet Me in 1987, which brought them closer to mainstream rock radio without fully crossing over. Pleased to Meet Me was recorded after Bob Stinson's departure and produced by Jim Dickinson, and it had a cleaner, more polished sound that sat uneasily between the band's underground identity and a commercial reach that never quite arrived. Alex Chilton, a tribute to the singer of Big Star, became one of their best-known songs from that period. Their live performances were legendary for their unpredictability. The band could be transcendent or a shambles, sometimes both in the same set. The line between deliberate provocation and genuine dysfunction was never entirely clear, and that ambiguity was part of what made them compelling to a certain kind of audience and maddening to another. Bob Stinson was asked to leave in 1986 amid personal difficulties that worsened over subsequent years. He died in 1995. The band reunited briefly in 2013 and 2014, with Westerberg and Tommy Stinson playing a handful of performances that reminded longtime fans of what had made the original band so alive. The Replacements were never a mainstream band. They were a band that a specific kind of young person in the 1980s felt was entirely and completely theirs. Number 1. Hüsker Dü. Hüsker Dü formed in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1979. The band consisted of vocalist and guitarist Bob Mould, drummer and vocalist Grant Hart, and bassist Greg Norton. They emerged from the American hardcore punk scene and spent the early 1980s releasing records of extraordinary intensity on the SST label. Fast, loud, dense, emotionally overwhelming in a way that most punk records of that era were not. Their 1984 double album, Zen Arcade, was a turning point, a conceptual record that ran over 70 minutes and moved through hardcore, acoustic passages, psychedelic noise, and pop melody in ways that had no real precedent in underground rock. It was recorded in a single session over roughly 40 hours and mixed in a day. It is still one of the most remarkable documents of American independent music in that decade. New Day Rising and Flip Your Wig, both released in 1985, continued the band's evolution, and their signing to Warner Brothers in 1986 made them one of the first hardcore-rooted bands to move to a major label. Candy Apple Grey and Warehouse. Songs and Stories followed, the latter a double album released in early 1987. By then, however, the band was falling apart. Mould and Hart's relationship had deteriorated severely, complicated by personal and creative tensions that had been building for years. The death of their manager, David Savoy, combined with Hart's struggles with drug dependency, made the band's continued existence untenable. They dissolved in January 1988 with almost no public announcement. The split was confirmed by word of mouth and a brief statement, rather than any formal declaration. Mould and Hart both went on to solo careers and additional bands. Mould formed Sugar in the early 1990s, and Hart launched Nova Mob. Hart died in September 2017 after a long illness. Hüsker Dü's influence on the generation of bands that followed them, including Nirvana, the Pixies, and virtually every American alternative rock band of the late 1980s and 1990s was enormous and widely acknowledged. For the Gen X listeners who found them in real time, they were not a band you explained. They were a band you felt, and then spent years trying to describe to people who hadn't heard them. Most of these bands never made it onto a greatest hits compilation or a classic rock station. They lived on cassette tapes, college radio, and the memories of people who were paying close attention during some very specific years. If any of these names brought something back, hit the like button and subscribe. We'll keep going.